Just a nurse playing nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling had called her 2 weeks ago in front of the residents, his smile sharp as a scalpel. They didn't know she'd closed wounds under fire that would have ended careers in a sterile operating room. They didn't know that the same hands restocking linens at 2 in the morning had once held a Marine's spine together while rounds landed 30 meters away. Margaret Walsh walked the night shift corridors of Mercy General in San Diego like a ghost, silver hair pinned back, movements economical, her presence designed to occupy space without demanding attention. Under her scrubs, 3 distinct scar patterns traced her left ribs like a road map nobody was meant to read. The tremor in her left hand only happened when she passed bed 12. She clocked in at 19:45 hours, the fluorescent lights already buzzing their mechanical hum above the nurse's station. The break room smelled like stale coffee and microwaved lasagna, the same way it had for 3 years. Margaret changed into her scrubs, navy blue, slightly loose in the shoulders, perfectly anonymous, and pulled her hair into the same tight bun she'd worn since arriving at Mercy General in 2021. No jewelry. No name badge with any rank. Just Margaret Walsh, RN, night shift, the kind of nurse who never called in sick, never complained about assignments, never made eye contact in the hallway. The kind of nurse people forgot the moment they looked away. The 2100 shift briefing happened without her. Margaret worked the hallways while the day nurses handed off to evenings, their voices carrying through the unit like ritual. She'd already memorized the patient list. Bed 4, post-op cholecystectomy, vital stable. Bed 7, pneumonia, antibiotics hanging, fever trending down. Bed 12, John Doe, severe traumatic brain injury, admitted 72 hours ago with nothing but combat boots and a head wound that had stolen his entire identity. Margaret moved past bed 12 without slowing her pace. She could feel the weight of his presence like atmospheric pressure, the way the air changes before a storm hits. The John Doe in bed 12 had a tattoo on his right forearm. She'd seen it once during the initial admission assessment, the faded ink reading M. Walsh, Sangin 2011, in military block letters. Her hands had tremored then too. She'd excused herself to the supply closet and stood in the dark for 3 minutes, breathing through her nose the way they'd taught her at Bagram. When she returned to the nurse's station, her hands were steady. Muscle memory took over. That's what they'd trained you for, the ability to compartmentalize horror into its own sealed chamber and keep moving forward. The boot sat under the bed frame, worn tan leather with the laces still tied in a double knot. The left heel had a scuff that looked like a bullet graze. She'd seen 1,000 boots like that, had cleaned blood from leather just like it, had carried men wearing them through valleys where the Taliban waited. But this John Doe, this army ranger with his shattered memory and his stitched scalp, had something written on his skin that shouldn't exist anymore. Something that contradicted everything she'd worked to bury for 13 years. Dr. Sterling appeared at 2,215 hours, moving through the unit like a man who owned the building. He didn't work night shift. The night shift was beneath him. But he'd been appearing more often lately, moving through the hallways with purpose, watching. Margaret kept her head down while she adjusted the cardiac monitor leads on a post-MI patient, her fingers working with the precise spacing of someone who'd placed defibrillator pads under actual fire. Sterling stood at the chart rack 3 feet away, pretending to review orders while his eyes tracked her movements. She could feel the weight of his attention like a scope crosshair on her spine. 2 weeks ago, Margaret had flagged a billing discrepancy. Just one small notation in the electronic health record system, a supply code that didn't match the actual inventory used, a phantom treatment listed for a cardiac patient who'd never received it. The charting had bothered her the way a scar bothers a medic, a sign that something underneath wasn't healing right. She'd mentioned it to the billing department. Mentioned it to Sterling during rounds. Mentioned it with the kind of careful documentation that military service teaches you, always create a record. Always cover your 6. Always assume the worst. The problem was that Dr. Sterling's partnership with Med Supply Solutions depended on those phantom treatments. The problem was that his cut of the inflated orders had already paid for a cabin in Aspen and a Tesla in the hospital parking garage. The problem was that Margaret Walsh, old, invisible, just a nurse playing nurse, had noticed the math wasn't adding up. Her charting was meticulous. Her notations impossible to ignore. And in the 2 weeks since she'd raised the first discrepancy, Sterling's interest in her movements had intensified. She was a liability with hands and a voice and a record that documented everything she saw. Margaret moved through the med pass like she'd been choreographed into these hallways: room for 14, check the fall line, verify the antibiotic infusion rate, adjust the pain medication, document vitals in the electronic record. Room for 18, patient sleeping, no intervention needed, note the time. Room for 21, family member at the bedside, polite nod, explain the monitor setup, answer questions with the kind of deference that made people stop seeing you. The deference was tactical. It was camouflage. It was the exact same technique she'd used to survive in places where a woman in military uniform made you a target. She reached bed 12 at 2,340 hours, moving with the same steady competence she'd used 1,000 times before. The John Doe's monitor showed a regular sinus rhythm, oxygen saturation 96%, blood pressure 128/79. He was breathing well. Healing. The swelling in his brain was decreasing with each CT scan. But the memory remained gone, locked away somewhere in the neurological dark that trauma creates. She checked his fall lines, verified the placement of his central catheter, and didn't look at his face. Looking at his face was dangerous. Looking at his face meant seeing a man she'd carried 3 miles through Sangin Valley while his leg bled out and the Taliban owned the high ground. Looking at his face meant remembering the weight of him, the heat of his blood on her hands, the exact moment she realized they weren't going to make it before his leg got too much worse and she'd have to make the choice between letting him die or amputating with a field knife. She'd chosen the field knife. He'd passed out from blood loss and shock. He'd woken up in a military hospital in Germany with his leg intact and no memory of the woman who'd saved it. The voice behind her came from nowhere, smooth, controlled, the kind of voice that practices menace in a mirror. Checking on our mystery patient. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway of bed 12, his hands in the pockets of his white coat, his smile the kind that showed teeth. Seems like a lot of personal attention for a John Doe. Margaret didn't turn around. She finished documenting the vital signs in the electronic record, her fingers moving across the keyboard with metronomic precision. The fluorescent lights hummed their permanent mechanical heartbeat. Somewhere down the hall, a patient's call light blinked red. Another bed, another person waiting. She logged out of the charting system before she responded. Standard assessment protocol, doctor. Her voice was flat, unremarkable, the voice of someone who'd learned to make words disappear the moment they left her mouth. Q for H vitals and neurochecks. You seem quite invested in this particular patient. Sterling's smile didn't move. More than the standard protocol would suggest. Margaret turned to face him. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was loose. There was no tremor, no heat in her face, no visible response to the accusation hanging in the air between them like a weapon. She'd been trained to absorb insults without flinching, to let men smaller than she was circle and snap without ever giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. This was just another variant of the same skill. He's a patient who needs care, Margaret said. That's all. Just a patient. Sterling nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they think they've figured something out. Not a personal connection. Not history. Just the standard care any nurse would provide. Margaret walked past him toward the medication cart. Behind her, she heard him step into the room with the John Doe, heard him say something quiet, words meant only for himself, words that floated like poison gas through the space she'd just occupied. Her hands tremored slightly as she pulled the next patient's medications, but the tremor was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking directly at them. And Sterling had already moved on, satisfied with whatever he thought he'd learned. What he didn't know was that Margaret's documentation was going to destroy his career. What he didn't understand was that she'd already compiled 7 billing discrepancies across for months, each one flagged in her meticulous handwriting in the hospital's permanent record. What he couldn't possibly suspect was that the old nurse with the tremor in her hand and the scars on her ribs was still following the same tactical protocol she'd learned in 2011, document everything, report through official channels, create an undeniable paper trail that no one could dismiss. The night stretched on. Margaret moved through the hallways like she'd been designed for them, her presence so quiet that people stopped registering her existence. She adjusted 4 lines and checked oxygen saturations and talked to patients who couldn't sleep and held the hand of a woman whose cancer had stopped responding to treatment. This was what she did. This was who she was supposed to be. A nurse. Just a nurse. An invisible woman in scrubs who remembered how to save lives but had promised herself that part of her story was finished. But in bed 12, the John Doe slept with a tattoo on his arm that said otherwise. And in the pharmaceutical supply room, the electronic records documented Dr. Sterling's fraud with the same precision that Margaret's hands used to close wounds under fire. And in the San Diego night, nobody knew that the woman checking vitals at 0300 hours was carrying secrets heavy enough to end careers. The next voice out of Sterling's mouth would change everything. Room 314 smelled like antiseptic and something Sterling had brought with him, cologne, expensive, the kind that announced itself like a territorial marker. Margaret was changing the Marine veteran's surgical dressing when Sterling's voice cut through the quiet like a scalpel. "Nurse Walsh, this is completely unacceptable." She didn't pause. Her hand stayed steady, working through the careful steps of sterile technique she'd performed 10,000 times. The Marine, Thompson, according to his chart, 3 tours, 2 Purple Hearts, watched her face more than his own wound. Sterling peeled back the dressing she'd placed with Navy trauma protocol precision. A first-year nursing student knows better than this hack job. "Do you see this? Contamination risk. Infection waiting to happen." He pointed at nothing. Margaret had left no gaps. There was no contamination. There was only a man who'd been hurt and hands that knew how to fix it. "How long have you been doing this?" Sterling's voice rose, pitched for the hallway. 30 years? And you still can't manage basic wound care?" Thompson's wife shifted in her chair, looking away. The daughter stared at her phone. Margaret took one measured breath, the kind that came from Sangin, from hours in the dark keeping men alive on the floor of a phi base while rounds came through the walls. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She let one tear track down her weathered cheek. One. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "That dressing was placed using Navy trauma protocol, Doctor." Sterling's smile went surgical. "Sharp. Practiced. The Navy? Is that where you learn to practice medicine without a license?" She didn't respond. She finished the dressing, careful, perfect, and disposed of the old materials. The room held its breath. Sterling left, his cologne lingering like a stain. Thompson's wife touched Margaret's arm as she passed. Said nothing. Some acknowledgements didn't require words. The break room pattern started the next day. Margaret sat down with her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee in a mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," and the room responded like she'd opened a door to somewhere toxic. Conversation stopped. Someone coughed. Within 30 seconds, 2 nurses grabbed their bags. A resident stood abruptly, said nothing, left. By 90 seconds, Margaret sat alone at a table built for 8, her sandwich untouched, her coffee cooling toward room temperature. It happened again at dinner break. Same timing. Same exit pattern. The precision was almost impressive, it had the coordination of something rehearsed. By Friday, they didn't even wait for her to sit. They saw her approaching the break room and the exodus began before she crossed the threshold. By Monday night, she stopped trying. She took her lunch to the supply closet and ate standing up, surrounded by boxes of gauze and 4 tubing, the fluorescent light flickering above her head like a heartbeat that couldn't quite commit. That Monday morning, Sterling posted his yellow paper on the unit board where everyone would see it before shift started. Margaret saw it during her pre-shift walkthrough at 1900 hours. The letters were bold, black, official. Disciplinary action, M. The Walsh, insubordination, failure to follow established protocols, unauthorized treatment decisions. Final warning before termination. The yellow paper glowed like a warning flare. By 2,100 hours, everyone had seen it. By 2,200 hours, people who'd worked beside her for 3 years treated her like she was already gone. During afternoon rounds 2 days later, Sterling dressed her down in front of 4 residents and 2 medical students. He did it in the hallway outside bed 8, loud enough that staff 3 rooms down turned to listen. Margaret stood with her hands at her sides, her badge catching the fluorescent light. "What we have here," Sterling said, his voice like honey poured over broken glass, "is a has-been playing nurse. Clinging to a job she can't perform anymore. It's sad, really. The kindest thing would be retirement. But some people don't know when they're done." The residents exchanged glances. One of the medical students looked at her shoes. Margaret's hands didn't shake. Her voice dropped an octave. "I've closed wounds you couldn't even identify, Doctor." Sterling's laugh was theatrical, designed to make her words seem absurd. "Is that what you tell yourself, Granny Walsh? That you're some kind of war hero nurse?" He turned to the residents. "This is what burnout looks like. Watch it. Remember it. Don't end up like this." The nickname stuck like infection. By evening shift, she heard it whispered. Granny Walsh picked up the blood draw kit. Granny Walsh charted the vitals. Granny Walsh was finishing soon, so don't expect much. It was death by 1,000 small wounds, and Sterling was very, very good at applying them. But that wasn't the worst part. Margaret discovered the pattern in Dr. Sterling's charts during a quiet Tuesday night at 0247 hours when the hospital held its breath between emergencies. She was pulling records for a patient whose wound vac appeared in Sterling's notes but not in supply logs, and one file led to another, and then there were 6, then 12. Med supply solutions, billed for arterial line kits never opened. Wound vacs never used. Specialty medications documented in charts but never removed from the pharmacy lockbox. She cross-referenced 3 months of billing against actual patient treatments. The mathematics was terrible and clean. $47,000 in phantom supplies. Maybe more. By Wednesday morning, Margaret had printed 6 patient charts with the discrepancies highlighted in precise yellow. She placed them in a sealed envelope on Linda Chen's desk, the hospital administrator, the person responsible for catching exactly this kind of problem. She signed the envelope. Dated it. Made a copy for herself. By noon, Sterling knew. She could see it in how he moved through the unit, faster, sharper, like something with teeth that had caught a scent. Chen's assistant was his former resident, and hospital politics moved at the speed of a phone call. Sterling made 3 calls from his car in the parking lot. Margaret watched him through the break room window, his mouth moving, his other hand gesturing though no one could see him. She recognized the posture. Command voice. Problem-solving mode. A man who knew how to move pieces. First call, Howard Marsh, board chairman, during his regular golf game at Torrey Pines. Sterling's voice through the window was smooth. Concerned. Professional. Linda's got a situation brewing, unstable night nurse, making accusations, I'm concerned about patient safety and potential liability. Second call, Margaret's previous supervisor at County General. I'm seeing some concerning patterns. Has she ever shown signs of instability? Made accusations before. Third call, Richard Voss, risk management consultant. Not a request. A summons. By evening, Voss was sitting in Chen's office reviewing Margaret's personnel file. Sterling had documented everything. 17 incident reports over 3 months. Each one carefully worded to suggest declining competence without explicit accusation. A pattern. A narrative. A story designed to make her look dangerous. The pattern is clear, Voss said, sliding his legal pad across Chen's desk like evidence at a trial. Liability exposure. Potential patient harm. Increasingly erratic behavior. You need to act before something catastrophic happens. Margaret cleaned bed 12 at 2,300 hours that night. The Army Ranger, James Garrett, according to the military ID found in his boot, remained in unconsciousness, his brain swelling slowly despite the intervention, his future written in scans no one had shared with him yet. She checked his vitals, adjusted his monitored the continuous cardiac monitoring with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions most people couldn't imagine. His fingers moved as she worked. Just slightly. Dragging across the white hospital sheet with intention she recognized from experience, a man trying to communicate through the fog, trying to leave a message the way soldiers did. His fingers traced for letters in the fabric, MHLA. Margaret stilled. Her breath caught in a way she hadn't allowed in months. She looked at his face, young, damaged, dreaming things he couldn't speak. She touched her pocket where her own military ID remained buried, the one with her photograph and her rank and the date she was supposed to have stopped existing. She whispered something she hadn't said aloud in 18 years. "I'm here, Ranger. I'm here." She didn't know if he heard her. She didn't know if it mattered. But when she finished her shift at 0600 hours and walked to her car through the San Diego morning, she carried something heavier than exhaustion. She carried the weight of a name she'd worn into battle and a face she'd seen die and a promise she'd made to ghosts. The rain started while she was driving home. It hammered the windshield like applause or accusations, and Margaret drove through it without turning on the radio, without turning on anything except the wipers. Just her and the sound of water hitting glass and a name traced in hospital sheets by fingers that remembered her before his brain did. The rain hadn't stopped since Tuesday evening. Margaret drove home from Mercy General with the wipers beating a rhythm against the windshield like some kind of accusation, and she thought about the chart she'd pulled at 0100 hours when the unit was quiet enough to think. Med Supply Solutions. 3 orders in 4 days. Unopened arterial line kits billed at $847 per unit. Wound vacs listed as deployed to Bed 12, the John Doe, the Army Ranger with the tattoo, except Margaret had personally inventoried those supplies and found them still in their original packaging, stacked on the crash cart shelf where they'd been for a week. The numbers didn't match the reality. They never did, not on Sterling's patients. She'd been nursing long enough to recognize a pattern, and patterns told stories if you knew how to read them. At 0115 on Wednesday, Margaret stood at the medication station reviewing the John Doe's updated chart, his neuro status, the subtle improvements she'd documented in her last shift notes, the way his eyes had begun tracking light and sound. His right hand had developed tremors, fine motor reflexes returning. The fingers on his left arm had flexed twice when she'd tested his grip. These weren't dramatic changes, but they mattered. They suggested emerging consciousness, a brain beginning to rewire itself after trauma. She was cross-referencing his current vitals against his admission labs when she heard the footstep behind her. Not the soft pad of nursing shoes. The deliberate click of dress loafers on tile, measured and controlled, the kind of approach that announced ownership of the space. "Step away from that patient, Nurse Walsh." Dr. Sterling stood 3 feet behind her, his white coat perfectly pressed, his tie silk and burgundy. His voice had that particular texture she'd learned to recognize, the calm that came before the knife went in. She looked up from the chart, and for just a moment, before she could arrange her face back into the careful neutrality she'd perfected, something flickered across her expression. Recognition. Understanding. "His neuroscience are changing, Doctor," she said quietly, keeping her tone level. "Finger movements. Possible emerging consciousness. His reflexes are." I said step away. His jaw tightened, a single muscle working beneath his skin like a trap closing. "You're no longer assigned to this patient." She held the chart against her chest. "I was documenting my observations from the last 4 hours. He's waking up. We should notify neurology, prepare for. Your documentation privileges for room 12 are revoked as of this moment." He pulled a pen from his coat pocket with a surgeon's precision and began writing on a blank order form, his strokes deliberate and heavy. Margaret watched his hand move across the paper, and in that handwriting she could read everything. This wasn't medicine. This was erasure. Margaret Walsh removed from patient care for room 12. All treatment decisions to go through attending physician directly. No nursing staff to perform procedures without explicit written authorization from Dr. Sterling. He posted the order at the nurse's station where the night shift could absorb it. Where everyone could see that she'd been restricted. Where the message was clear, this patient was Sterling's, and Margaret's hands were not permitted to touch him. This patient requires specialized monitoring you're not qualified to provide, Sterling said, his voice carrying across the station so the other nurses would hear. The thing about Sterling was that he never shouted. He never needed to. His voice was the sound of institutional power, and institutional power moved faster than rage. Consider this a restriction of duties pending your performance review. We can discuss your future at Mercy General once that's completed. He returned to the medication station to retrieve something, a pen, a chart, some small object that allowed him to turn away from her with the finality of a verdict. Margaret stood holding the chart for the John Doe, and the pattern crystallized into focus. Sterling had admitted him on arrival. Sterling had ordered the initial imaging, the blood work, the initial neuro-consult that had been mysteriously cancelled. Sterling had written the original admission orders that kept the John Doe isolated in room 12, away from the busier units where multiple staff members would rotate through and notice things. Sterling had been managing this patient's entire care arc while simultaneously billing for supplies that had never been used, creating a ghost of medical necessity where none existed. The John Doe had been useful to Sterling, a billing opportunity, a line item on an invoice to MedSupply Solutions, a source of reimbursement that left no real trace because the patient himself was a ghost. No family. No ID. No one to verify whether treatments had actually occurred. But the John Doe was waking up. That was the problem. A conscious patient could talk. A conscious patient with a memory could contradict the record. At 0230, Margaret walked past bed 12 to deliver clean linen to the room across the hallway. Through the window, she could see him clearly, the ranger, Garrett, though she wasn't supposed to know his name from the casualty report she'd never officially read. His eyes were moving rapidly beneath closed lids, the kind of rapid eye movement that meant dreaming, which meant deeper consciousness returning. His right hand trembled against the bed rail, small involuntary movements. His lips moved silently, forming words that had no sound yet, and Margaret heard them anyway because she'd held those lips shut with her palm to stop him from screaming when the pain became more than the human body could process in Sangin 18 years ago, when he was a ranger and she was a senior chief and the only thing between him and exsanguination was her hands and her knowledge and a prayer in a language she'd forgotten. She reached for the door handle. "Nurse Walsh." Sterling's voice came from the end of the hallway, and he was holding coffee, actually holding coffee, as if he'd been waiting there, positioned and patient, watching for exactly this moment. His presence made the air feel thinner, more pressurized. "I believe I was clear about your restrictions." She pulled her hand back. The door remained closed. She could see Garrett's trembling hand through the window, could see the words still forming on his lips, and she could not touch him. By 02:45, she sat in the break room alone. The other nurses had learned not to sit with her after the incident in room 314, after Sterling had dressed her down in front of the residents and the Marine's family had watched the humiliation unfold like a curtain call nobody wanted to witness. The break room had become a space she occupied separately, the way radiation wards isolated contamination. Linda Chen had left an envelope in her mailbox at shift change, white, sealed, official. Margaret opened it with hands that remained completely steady because they'd been trained in a place where trembling meant you died and the people around you died, and sometimes the trembling came later, much later, when you were alone. Employment terminated effective immediately for insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and practicing beyond scope of nursing license. Final paycheck available Friday. She read it twice. The language was Sterling's, but the signature was from hospital administration. He'd moved fast. He'd called people, activated the network, made this termination sound not like retaliation but like procedure. The document said her performance review was incomplete pending investigation into her conduct, which meant there would be no reference from Mercy General, no verification of the 6 years she'd worked here with a record that had been unblemished until Sterling had decided she was a problem. Outside, rain hammered against the break room windows with the sound of applause or accusations, and Margaret stared at the termination notice and thought about another kind of rain, about Sangin in 2011, about a young ranger screaming her name while his leg bled out and she was dragging him through Taliban crossfire with her hands locked under his armpits and her own shoulder already shattered from a 9mm round that had come too close. She dragged him 3 miles. 3 miles through rain and dust and gunfire and the kind of fear that never really stopped. It just learned to live in your blood and your muscle memory and your hands that knew how to hold people together when everything was falling apart. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the ranger, Garrett, had a military ID. She'd found it when she was prepping his admission assessment, tucked inside his boot along with $340 in cash and a photograph of a younger version of the same face, smiling at the camera. His name was Garrett Holloway. His rank was Ranger, 75th Ranger Regiment. His unit was 2nd Battalion Bravo Company. His date of service began in 2009 and had been marked indefinite leave in 2012, just after Sangin, just after the casualty report she'd read on a classified terminal she shouldn't have had access to. The military ID had been placed in a secure envelope in the hospital safe per protocol, but Margaret had documented it. She'd written his actual name in her notes. She'd logged his real identity into the system. And then Sterling had locked her out of his care entirely. Margaret folded the termination notice and placed it back in the envelope. She finished her coffee, which had gone cold an hour ago and tasted like rust and regret. She stood up from the break room table, her movements deliberate and measured, each muscle responding exactly as intended. She'd been trained to move this way, economical, controlled, impossible to read. The kind of movement that came from knowing that every gesture was either useful or wasted, and wasted motion meant death. She clocked out at 0247. She turned in her badge to the night supervisor without comment. She walked through the emergency department doors and into the rain, which hammered down on her like a verdict, and she thought about the fact that somewhere in the hospital behind her, a man was waking up who would remember her name. She thought about the fact that Sterling was banking on that man never finding his voice, never finding his memory, staying in that liminal space between unconscious and aware where the dead and the living both reside. She thought about the fact that she'd just been removed from the only legal position she'd held in 18 years, and somehow, that mattered far less than she'd expected it to. Her hands were no longer bound by a uniform or a hospital protocol or the careful fiction she'd constructed of being just another nurse, just another aging woman pushing medications and changing dressings and asking no questions about the system that employed her. Her hands were free now, and her hands had held warriors together in places where the Geneva Convention was a distant memory and mercy was the only law that mattered. Sterling had made exactly one mistake. He'd forgotten that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who've already survived the worst. He'd forgotten that someone who'd been through Sangin didn't tremble at the loss of employment. He'd forgotten that a woman who'd kept a ranger alive for 3 miles through Taliban fire while her own shoulder bled out didn't actually need a hospital badge to be useful. He'd forgotten, most importantly, that the Army Ranger in bed 12 was starting to remember her name. The alarm for bed 12 shrieked at 0317, a sound that cut through the hallway like a blade through silk. Margaret was 3 floors down, still in her street clothes, rain-soaked scrubs stuffed in the cardboard box at her feet, when her hands moved before her mind caught up. She was running. She was always running toward the sound of someone dying. The monitor showed the story in real time. Oxygen saturation dropping, 94, 88, 75. His trachea visibly shifted to the left. His chest rising only on one side. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed, pressure building in his chest cavity like a fist closing around his heart, crushing it with every second that passed. The night resident, fresh out of medical school, hands trembling, was still fumbling with his phone 20 feet away, calling for backup, calling for the attending, calling for anyone but the woman who actually knew how to fix this. Margaret didn't wait. She moved into the room like muscle memory made flesh, grabbed a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, tore open Garrett's gown, and counted ribs with her fingers the way she'd done in 100 field emergencies under fire, under artillery, under conditions that would have broken most people into pieces. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands found the anatomy like a pilot's hands find the controls of a Black Hawk in total darkness. She drove the needle between his ribs into the pleural space. The hiss of released pressure was immediate. Instantaneous. That sound, that beautiful, unmistakable hiss of air escaping, marked the difference between Garrett's death and survival. His good lung expanded. His oxygen levels climbed. 92. 95. 98. Sinus rhythm stabilized. She held the needle steady with both hands, her own breathing controlled, professional, deliberate, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could throw at her. The resident stared. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Who authorized you to? He was dying, Margaret said simply. Her voice carried the weight of a woman who had already made peace with the cost of being right. She didn't wait for his response. She was already documenting the procedure on the chart, her handwriting precise despite the tremor in her fingertips that came not from fear but from restraint. The trembling wasn't panic, it was the physical effort of holding back 18 years of military precision, 18 years of combat medicine, 18 years of saving lives in conditions that made an ICU look like a luxury resort. Dr. Sterling was in the ICU within 18 minutes. She watched him arrive from the hallway, saw his face flush the color of old brick, saw his phone already pressed to his ear before he reached bed 12. His voice was low, controlled, surgical. He was calling the hospital board chairman. He was calling her supervisors references with carefully phrased concerns about instability, about recklessness, about a nurse who couldn't follow orders. He was already constructing the narrative that would bury her before anyone could ask why a woman he'd explicitly tried to remove from a patient's care had just saved that patient's life. By 0400, Richard Voss was back in Linda Chen's office with Sterling at his side. By 0600, Margaret stood in that same office while Sterling presented his case like a prosecutor building a death penalty argument. His tie was perfectly knotted. His voice was reasonable, measured, the voice of a man who understood institutional power the way a predator understands prey. She was explicitly removed from this patient's care, he said, his hands folded on the desk. Explicitly ordered not to touch him. This is exactly the reckless, unauthorized behavior I documented in her file. She performed an invasive procedure without physician orders, without proper supervision, endangering this patient's life. This is a termination-level offense. Chen's voice was tired. She saved his life, Marcus. She violated direct orders and hospital protocol. This is grounds for immediate termination and license review. The liability alone. She saved his life, Chen repeated, but there was no power in it. Sterling had already made his calls. He had already positioned his allies. He had already written the narrative that would make Margaret Walsh, a woman who had dragged wounded soldiers through Taliban crossfire, a woman whose hands had held more lives together than Sterling had patience, look like a liability. By 0800, Margaret stood at a rain-soaked bus stop with a cardboard box balanced on her hip. The box was the kind people used to carry away the remains of their professional lives, tissues, photos, a plant that was already dying despite her best efforts to keep it alive. Inside was a cracked mug reading the world's okayest nurse. A dying succulent. A photograph of her daughter Emily in dress blues, killed in action 4 years ago in Kandahar, smiling with the kind of smile that didn't belong to a woman who would be dead within 6 months. The rain soaked through what remained of her scrubs. It dripped off her silver hair in rivulets. A single tear tracked down her weathered cheek, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, not a gesture of surrender, but of clearing her vision. The box wobbled dangerously. She adjusted it against her hip, her arms strong, her posture unbroken. She was broken. But she would not show it. The black SUVs arrived at Mercy General at 0920 the next morning, sliding up to the emergency entrance like sharks sensing blood in the water. 2 federal agents emerged first, their suits identical, their faces carved from the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice. Behind them came the detainee, shackled, orange jumpsuit bright against the white morning, a former Taliban commander injured during transport, his face pocked and scarred from 30 years of desert warfare. They wheeled him past the nurse's station on a gurney. Margaret was collecting her final paycheck at the administrative window, her back to the hallway, when his eyes found her through the glass. Found her like a homing missile finding its target. He went rigid. The entire gurney seemed to stop. The monitors attached to his chest began to show his fear in real time, heart rate climbing, blood pressure spiking, the physical signature of a man who had just seen a ghost. Malakul Mort, he whispered in Pashto. The words echoed in the quiet hallway like a curse, like a prayer, like the name of something that had hunted him through nightmares for 15 years. Angel of Death. Malakul Mort. His voice rose to a shout now, his shackled hands pointing at Margaret, his entire body going rigid against the restraints, screaming the name again and again, refusing to let the agents touch him, refusing to move forward, his eyes locked on a woman he thought was dead, a woman who had supposedly been buried in the classified graveyards of a military that dealt in ghosts and erased personnel the way other organizations erased files. The agents froze. The nurses froze. Margaret, standing motionless by the administrative window, her final paycheck still in her hand, felt her carefully constructed civilian life shatter like glass under pressure. The agents made calls. They made a lot of calls. Within 30 minutes, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen was on speakerphone in Linda Chen's office, and Sarah's voice, Emily's best friend, now Naval Intelligence, a woman who had lost the same person Margaret had lost, cracked as she spoke, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. If he knows that name, if he's identifying her, you need to evacuate the building right now. That man should be terrified. People who encounter Senior Chief Walsh in combat tend to stop existing after that. Linda Chen's hands trembled as she pulled a second file from the locked cabinet. Not the thin civilian file. The other one. The classified one, flagged with federal seals, stamped with warnings in red ink that made the administrator's face go pale as she read aloud, her voice shaking, Walsh, Margaret Ann, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Navy Special Warfare Command, Embedded Operations with Army Ranger Units, Sangin Valley, Helm and Province, Extraction Specialist, Multiple Classified Operations, record sealed under executive order. Jesus Christ! The Navy made her disappear. They erased her. The Navy erased her? By 1100, Commander Jake Morrison from SEAL Team 3 stood in the hospital lobby in dress whites that looked like they'd been carved from fresh snow, his bearing the kind of military precision that made the space around him seem smaller. His voice carried to every corner of the lobby, to the waiting room, to the reception desk, to anywhere sound could travel and authority could reach. 2 silver stars, he said, each word deliberate, each word a blow. Navy Cross. For Purple Hearts. Senior Chief Walsh saved 37 lives in Sangin alone. She dragged wounded Rangers 3 miles through Taliban crossfire. She held wounds closed with her own hands while enemy fire tore the world apart around her. She's a goddamn legend. Dr. Sterling had pressed himself into the corner near the elevators, his face the color of old concrete, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish suffocating in air. Patterson from the FBI arrived at 11:45 with a briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain the weight of someone's entire erased existence. His voice was flat, administrative, the voice of a government official reading facts that had been classified so deeply they'd never seen sunlight. Operation Copper Dragon was buried with congressional oversight. Approved by the Joint Chiefs. Senior Chief Walsh was the linchpin of that operation. She extracted a high-value target under conditions you can't imagine. The military ordered her to disappear because her existence endangered everyone she'd served with. The records don't exist. Officially, she never served. Officially, she never existed. Sterling tried to speak. His jaw moved. Nothing came out. Morrison turned on him with the kind of movement that suggested he'd trained for this exact moment. Shut your mouth, Doctor. The sound of boots on tile echoed through the lobby, 3 more Navy personnel entering the hospital, their uniforms sharp, their presence absolute. They saluted Margaret where she stood frozen by the window, holding her final paycheck in trembling hands, watching the architecture of Dr. Sterling's institutional power collapse like a sandcastle facing the tide. The wheels of the stretcher caught the tile with a squeak that echoed down the corridor. Two federal agents flanked a shackled detainee, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the sterile white walls of Mercy General's surgical wing. The man's eyes were dark as burnt motor oil, scanning the hallway with the calculation of someone who'd survived worse than hospitals. Margaret stood at the nurse's station updating charts when his gaze locked onto hers through the glass partition. His entire body went rigid. The chains clinked as he lurched forward, and his voice dropped to a rasp in Pashto, the words landing like stones into still water, Malakal Mort. Angel of Death. He began shouting, thrashing against his restraints, refusing to let the surgical team touch him. His voice cracked with something between fear and recognition. The agents exchanged glances, one of them turning to the charge nurse. What's he saying? Why is he refusing treatment? Margaret didn't move. The clipboard felt weightless in her hands. The detainee's eyes never left hers, and the recognition in them was absolute, not the kind of recognition that comes from seeing someone once, but the kind burned into memory by survival. The agents moved toward Margaret without waiting for translation. You. What did he say? Her composure held like reinforced steel. When she spoke, her voice was steady as a pulse. He knows me. From before. The words hung in the fluorescent air, simple and damning. One agent pulled out his phone and made a call that would end everything, the careful architecture of civilian life she'd constructed over 18 years, the quiet mornings, the anonymous shifts, the identity she'd borrowed and lived in like borrowed scrubs. Within 30 minutes, Linda Chen stood in the hospital corridor in full Navy dress whites, her lieutenant commander insignia catching the overhead lights like a warning. She'd been Margaret's daughter's best friend once, back when Margaret's daughter was still breathing. Linda's eyes moved across Margaret's face, and something in her jaw tightened with recognition. She turned to the federal agents, that senior chief petty officer Margaret Walsh. Her voice cracked on the rank that hadn't been spoken aloud in 12 years, the rank that had been buried in redacted files and classified archives. I can verify her operational history. Everything she did in Sangin. Everything. A hospital administrator appeared, his face the color of old paper, carrying a folder that had been locked in a secure drawer since Margaret's hire. His hands trembled as he opened it, reading aloud. It embedded operations with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Kandahar Province, 2008 through 2012. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Navy Medical Corps. Commendation citations. Operational designations. Code name, Angel 6. Each word was a key turning in a lock Margaret thought had been welded shut. The folder contained her real life, the one the Navy had erased the day they told her she was too valuable and too exposed to exist officially anymore. Then Commander James Morrison walked into the lobby in dress blues, a SEAL team leader with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He moved toward Margaret with the deliberate respect of someone greeting a monument. Senior Chief. He saluted, a sharp fist to his chest, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ceremony, Bronze Star. He paused, letting it settle. Silver Star. Another pause, longer this time. Heads turned throughout the lobby. Second Silver Star. The words fell like hammer blows. For Purple Hearts. A nurse wheeled a crash cart past and didn't even look, but everyone else had stopped moving. Navy Cross. His voice dropped lower. You were the linchpin of Operation Copper Dragon, a classified operation with congressional oversight. 37 confirmed saves in Sangin alone. The record still stands. Margaret's hands hung at her sides, and for the first time in 12 years, she didn't hide the scars. The silver lines on her palms caught the light, map of a life spent bleeding into the hands of others so they could live. In the corner near the radiology department, Dr. Marcus Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. The surgical mask he'd been wearing hung around his neck like evidence. His mouth opened and closed without sound. FBI Special Agent Patterson made notes, his pen moving with methodical precision. The detainee you identified as knowing you, Taliban Commander, Ahmed Rashid. He's been in custody for 14 months. The moment he recognized you, we had confirmation of your operational footprint in Sangin. He paused. And confirmation that everything Dr. Sterling told us about your termination was a lie built on top of another lie. The security guard who'd handed Margaret the cardboard box yesterday appeared at Sterling's office door. The same guard, the same neutral expression, holding another identical cardboard box. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling's hands shook as he packed the box, his nameplate, his coffee mug reading "World's Best Doctor," the framed photo of his boat. The rain that had started that morning was still falling, heavier now, drumming against the windows like a closing argument. By evening, the news had reached the state medical board. By morning, Sterling's license was under suspension pending fraud investigation. By week's end, federal auditors had found $217,000 in phantom charges running through MedSupply Solutions. By month's end, he was sitting at a folding table under a cheap banner on El Cajon Boulevard, selling supplemental insurance to people who wouldn't look at him twice. 6 months later, the VA hospital 3 blocks away had become Margaret's kingdom, though she'd never sought kingdoms. She moved through the trauma unit like water finds its level, efficient, necessary, present. Her Navy credentials were visible on her badge now, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, and when she walked into a room, the young corpsmen straightened because they understood they were in the presence of someone who'd written their textbooks in blood and sand. The break room made space for her at the table without being asked. In bed 4, James Garrett sat upright, his memory returned in pieces over weeks of careful rehabilitation. When Margaret entered for evening rounds, his eyes tracked her with the clarity of someone remembering not a face but a voice, her voice telling him stories about his daughter to keep him conscious while his leg bled out onto Sangin Valley dust. He reached up and touched the faded tattoo on his arm, M. Walsh, Sangin 2011. The tears came without warning, wet tracks down his weathered face. "I remember now, Senior Chief. I remember everything. You carried me 3 miles. You wouldn't let me die." Margaret sat on the edge of his bed and took his hand, and for the first time in 18 years, she let herself be held by someone who understood the weight of what she'd carried. Her daughter's photo hung on her office wall now, alongside a shadow box containing her decorations. Commander Morrison had brought it, unwrapped it with ceremony, and said simply, "These belong on a wall, Senior Chief. Not in storage. Not hidden." Margaret looked at her daughter's uniform, at the Navy Cross inside the glass case, and began training a new generation of Navy corpsmen at the VA, young people who'd never heard the name Angel of Death, who only knew the woman who taught them that class wasn't a rank or a title. It was what you did when the lights went out and no one was watching. It was the choice to save someone when letting them die would have been easier. It was showing up, again and again, for people you'd never met before and would never see again. That was class. That was the only measure that mattered. Subscribe to see more stories where the quiet ones change everything. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value. And comment, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?